Allora I topi devono restare nei muri. Then the mice must stay in the walls. The sharp clatter of a silver fork hitting a porcelain plate shattered the ambient hum of the refrigerators. I froze. I hadn't realized the entire diner had gone dead silent. I hadn't realized Matthew, the terrifying boss of the city's largest syndicate sitting at booth 4, was staring at me with eyes like crushed ice. Hours later, as the rain battered the windows and his armed men locked the diner's front doors, sealing us inside, Matthew leaned back and whispered to his lieutenant, "Don't let her leave." The rain in this city never just fell. It assaulted the pavement. It was a relentless, cold drumming against the large, grease-stained windows of Sal's all-night diner, a sound that had become the backing track to my hollowed-out existence. My name was Nora, at least. That was the name stitched in fading red thread onto the breast pocket of my powder blue uniform. It was a good name, a quiet name, a name that didn't carry the metallic scent of blood or the heavy, suffocating weight of a legacy I had crossed an ocean to escape. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The diner smelled, as it always did, of burnt filter coffee, industrial bleach, and the lingering ghost of fried onions. I stood behind the Formica counter, a damp rag clutched in my right hand, mindlessly wiping a circle into the laminate that was already worn smooth by 1,000 similar nights. My feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a phantom pain that resonated up my calves and settled into the base of my spine. I welcomed the exhaustion. Exhaustion meant I wouldn't dream. Exhaustion meant survival. The bell above the heavy glass door jingled, a sharp, cheerful sound that violently contradicted the atmosphere of the room. The wind howled for a fraction of a second before the door was pulled shut, sealing the diner once more in its greasy, warm bubble. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my eyes on the circular motion of my rag. In a city like this, on the graveyard shift in a neighborhood the police deliberately ignored, making eye contact was a rookie mistake. You learn to read people by their shoes, by the way they walked, by the sound of their damp coats hitting the vinyl booths. Heavy leather boots, Italian craftsmanship, immaculately polished despite the torrential downpour outside. 5 sets of them. They moved with a terrifying synchronization, spreading out across the diner like a dark oil spill. 2 men took positions by the door, their hands resting casually but purposefully inside the linings of their dark wool overcoats. One moved toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, a silent phantom checking for blind spots. And then there was him. He didn't walk, he commanded the space. The air pressure in the diner seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker, as he moved toward booth 4, the large corner booth that offered a clear view of the entire room, the exits, and the street outside. I finally raised my eyes. Matthew. No one in the underworld used his last name. He didn't need one. He was a force of nature, a myth whispered about in the dark alleys and back rooms of the city's sprawling criminal network. He was young for a syndicate boss, perhaps in his late 30s, but his face carried the weathered, hardened architecture of a man who had lived a dozen violent lifetimes. His hair was dark, slicked back with rain and discipline, and his eyes were a startling pale gray like the sky just before a blizzard. He slid into the booth. The leather groaned softly under his weight. His lieutenant, a mountain of a man with a scar jagged across his jawline, sat opposite him. The 3 remaining patrons in the diner, a weary truck driver, a runaway teenager nursing a cold, hot chocolate, and an old man reading yesterday's newspaper, suddenly shrank into themselves. They didn't leave. Sudden movements drew attention, but they stopped chewing, stopped reading, practically stopped breathing. "Coffee," Matthew said. His voice was low, a dark rumble that effortlessly cut through the ambient noise of the humming refrigerators. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He stared out the window into the driving rain. His expression unreadable. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I forced my hand to stop trembling as I reached for the glass carafe on the burner. Pouring a cup of coffee was an action I had performed 10,000 times, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. But as I walked from behind the counter toward booth 4, the ceramic mug rattling infinitesimally against its saucer, I felt the phantom crosshairs on the back of my neck. "Black," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, setting the cup down in front of him. "Just brewed." Matthew didn't acknowledge me. His lieutenant gave me a curt, dismissive nod. A silent dismissal. I retreated to the safety of the counter, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. 3 years of blending into the wallpaper, of being the invisible, exhausted waitress. I had survived by being unremarkable. But as I stood there, watching the condensation weep down the front windows, a cold, creeping sense of dread began to coil in my stomach. A primal instinct, honed by a childhood spent in the shadows of violent men, screamed at me. Something was wrong. The air was too still. The silence from booth 4 was too heavy. I just didn't know yet that the fragile glass house of my fake life was about to shatter completely. The clock on the wall, shaped like a giant, grinning coffee bean, ticked forward with agonizing slowness. 2:45 a.m. The truck driver had paid in exact change, leaving without a word. The teenager had fallen asleep against the window. The old man was staring blankly at the sports page. In booth 4, Matthew and his lieutenant sat in absolute, terrifying silence. The coffee in Matthew's mug had long since gone cold, a dark, untouched mirror reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. They weren't eating. They weren't talking. They were waiting. I was in the middle of wiping down the milkshake machine, my mind desperately trying to retreat to a blank, numb state, when the phone rang. It wasn't the standard diner landline that sat by the cash register. It was the heavy, black rotary phone mounted on the wall near the kitchen swinging doors, a relic from the 1980s that the owner, Sal, insisted on keeping connected. For emergencies, he had told me on my first day, his voice thick with a smoker's rasp. "If that one rings, Nora, you don't ignore it." In 3 years, it had never rung. Not once. The sound was jarring, a harsh, metallic brewing that tore through the quiet tension of the diner like a gunshot. I jumped, dropping the rag. The old man rustled his newspaper. The men at the door stiffened, their postures instantly shifting from relaxed vigilance to coiled aggression. Matthew's head snapped toward the sound, those pale gray eyes locking onto the black plastic mounted on the wall. It rang again. Brrr. Sal was in the back, asleep on a cot in his cramped office. He wouldn't hear it over the roar of the industrial ventilation fan. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the counter. My instinct screamed at me to step away, to let it ring until whoever it was gave up. But the heavy, suffocating weight of Matthew's gaze was burning into the side of my face. If I ignored it, I was drawing attention to my fear. If I answered it, I was stepping into the unknown. Brrring. I wiped my damp palms on my apron and took the 5 steps to the wall. I lifted the heavy receiver and brought it to my ear. "Sal's Diner," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic hammering of my pulse. There was a burst of static on the line, the sound of heavy rain, and the unmistakable, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of windshield wipers on their highest setting. Then, a voice. It was a man's voice, rough, breathless, and laced with an adrenaline-fueled panic that transcended language. But it wasn't the panic that froze the blood in my veins. It was the language itself. I gufi sono in volo. Ripeto. I gufi sono in volo sotto la pioggia. The owls are in flight. I repeat, the owls are in flight in the rain. It wasn't just Italian. It was a thick, archaic Palermitano dialect. It was the language of the old neighborhoods. The language spoken by men who conducted their business in shadows and whispered threats over bitter espresso. More importantly, it was a code I hadn't heard since I was 14 years old, standing in the cold stone courtyard of my family's estate in Sicily. My mind went entirely blank. 3 years of careful conditioning, of building Nora, the quiet waitress, instantly evaporated. The terrified girl hidden beneath the powder blue uniform vanished, replaced by the daughter of a Don. The conditioning of my childhood, the ingrained rules of survival, the automatic responses to coded warnings overrode my conscious thought. Before I could stop myself, before the rational, terrified part of my brain could clamp my jaws shut, I answered. The words slipped out, smooth, instinctual, and flawless. Allora I topi devono restare nei muri. Then the mice must stay in the walls. The line went dead with a sharp click. I stood there for a long, agonizing second, the heavy receiver pressed against my ear. Listening to the dial tone, a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The realization of what I had just done crashed over me like a physical blow. I had spoken Italian. I had responded to a Mafia hit code. I had just painted a massive, glowing target on my own back. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, I placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The click of plastic meeting plastic sounded as loud as a thunderclap. I turned around. The diner was a mausoleum. The ambient noise seemed to have vanished. The teenager was awake, staring. The old man had lowered his paper. But I didn't care about them. My eyes met Matthew's. He was standing. He had risen from booth 4 without making a sound. His lieutenant was also on his feet, his hand resting visibly on the dark metal protruding from his waistband. The men at the doors had drawn their weapons, the dull gunmetal catching the harsh fluorescent light. Matthew wasn't looking at me like a patron looks at a waitress. He was looking at me like a predator looks at a sudden, unexpected variable in his hunting ground. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his pale eyes burning with a sudden, intense calculation. He had heard me. He knew exactly what language I had spoken. And given the sudden drawing of weapons, he knew exactly what the code meant. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap. Matthew took a slow, deliberate step out of the booth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Lock the doors, he said to the men at the front. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the room like the slamming of a prison cell. Then Matthew looked directly at me, his gaze stripping away the uniform, the name tag, the false identity. Don't let her leave. The click of the deadbolt severed my connection to the outside world. The diner transformed instantly from a sanctuary of mediocrity into a brightly lit cage. The air grew stale, heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the scent of damp wool. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I backed up against the stainless steel counter of the prep area, my hands gripping the edge so hard, my knuckles turned white. Hey, you can't just lock us in here. The truck driver, a burly man in a plaid shirt, stood up from his stool, his voice trembling with a mixture of faux bravado and genuine terror. Matthew didn't even turn his head. He merely gestured with 2 fingers. The man by the door stepped forward, moving with terrifying speed, and shoved the flat of his hand hard into the trucker's chest. The big man stumbled backward, collapsing into a booth with a heavy grunt. "Sit down," the guard said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Stay quiet. Live. The trucker shrank into the vinyl, his eyes wide. The teenager was silently crying, tears cutting tracks through her heavy eyeliner. The old man hadn't moved a muscle. Matthew walked slowly toward the counter. Every step was deliberate, an exercise in controlled power. He stopped just on the other side of the laminate, separated from me by a mere 2 feet, up close. The pale gray of his eyes was almost translucent, revealing nothing, reflecting everything. He smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and leather. He looked at my name tag. Nora. He said it slowly, testing the syllables, finding them lacking. He looked up, his gaze locking onto mine. Where did you learn to speak like that, Nora? I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered, forcing my voice to tremble, playing the terrified civilian. It wasn't entirely an act. I was terrified, but not of the guns. I was terrified of being discovered. It was just a wrong number. A prank call. I just repeated some gibberish back to them. Matthew didn't blink. He reached across the counter. I flinched, pulling back, but his hand moved with frightening speed, his fingers wrapping gently but immovably around my wrist. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to his cold demeanor. Do not lie to me, he said softly, the rumble of his voice vibrating through the counter. That wasn't gibberish. That was a specific regional dialect from the streets of Palermo. And that specific phrase was a countersign, a warning. You didn't just understand it. You answered it instinctively. His thumb brushed lightly over the pulse point on my wrist. I knew he could feel my heart racing, hammering against my veins like a trapped bird. Who are you working for? His voice dropped an octave, laced with a sudden, lethal edge. Nobody, I gasped, trying to pull my arm away. His grip tightened infinitesimally. I swear to God, I'm just a waitress. I've worked here for 3 years. Ask Sal. Ask anyone. I don't care about Sal, Matthew said dismissively. I care about the fact that a hit squad just called this diner to confirm my location, and my waitress just told them to hold their fire. The words hit me like a physical blow. The code. The owls are in flight. The hitmen were on their way. The mice must stay in the walls. Stand down. Wait. By answering the phone, by using my childhood conditioning, I hadn't just revealed my origins. I had inadvertently paused an assassination attempt. I didn't know, I whispered, the facade cracking. I swear, it was a reflex. A reflex, Matthew repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching in a humorless smile. Civilians don't have that reflex. Street thugs don't have that reflex. You speak like a ghost, Nora, like someone raised inside the old families. He let go of my wrist, but the ghost of his touch remained, burning against my skin. He leaned closer, over the counter. So, I'm going to ask you one more time, and your answer will determine whether you walk out of this diner alive when the sun comes up. His pale eyes bored into my soul. What is your real name? I opened my mouth to lie again, to spin a web of deceit about a Sicilian grandmother or a semester abroad. But before I could form the words, the world outside the diner exploded. The memory crashed over me, violent and unbidden, triggered by the smell of ozone and impending violence. I was 14 again. The sun was beating down on the terracotta tiles of our villa in Palermo, the air thick with the scent of crushed lemons and sea salt. My father, Don Alessandro Falcone, stood on the balcony, his back rigid. Below, in the courtyard, 3 black sedans had just pulled up. Men with hard faces and tailored suits poured out. Eleonora, my father had said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, refusing to look at me. Go to the cellar. Do not come out until your brother comes for you. If anyone else comes, what do you tell them? I was trembling, clutching the fabric of my summer dress. I tell them nothing, Papa. And if they ask about the owls, the mice must stay in the walls, I recited. The code drilled into my head since I could walk. He had finally turned to me, his eyes dark with a sorrow I wouldn't understand until much later. Good girl. Now, run. That was the last time I saw him alive. The rival families, the Corleonesi, had united to wipe the Falcones from the map. They slaughtered everyone. My father, my brothers, my uncles. I survived only because I knew how to stay in the walls. I spent 3 days hiding in the dark, listening to the screams, listening to the destruction of my legacy. When I finally emerged, I was a ghost. I smuggled myself on a freighter to America, buried the name Eleonora Falcone, and became Nora, a girl with no past and no future. The memory shattered instantly as a deafening roar tore through the present. The large front window of the diner, the one facing the street, simply vanished. There was no sound of breaking glass, just a concussive shockwave that blew inward, carrying with it a hail of shattered safety glass and the terrifying staccato pop-pop-pop of automatic weapons fire. The pause I had inadvertently bought with my phone call was over. The owls had arrived. Get down, Matthew roared. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't dive for cover. With a terrifying fluid motion, he lunged over the counter. His massive body crashed into mine, taking us both to the floor just as a line of bullet holes stitched their way across the stainless steel coffee urns behind me. Scalding water and dark coffee erupted into the air, raining down on the tiles. The diner descended into absolute chaos. The lights shattered, plunging us into a strobe-lit nightmare illuminated only by the muzzle flashes from the street and the sparking neon outside. The truck driver screamed. The lieutenant was returning fire, his heavy pistol booming over the din of the assault rifles. I was pinned to the greasy floor tiles beneath the weight of the city's most dangerous man. Matthew's arm was thrown over my head, shielding me from the falling debris. His breathing was heavy, steady, contrasting wildly with the frantic hammering of my own heart. "Stay low," he grunted, rolling off me just enough to draw a heavy automatic weapon from a shoulder holster hidden beneath his coat. "They're shooting at us!" I screamed. The obviousness of the statement a desperate plea for sanity in a world that had just gone mad. "They're shooting at me," Matthew corrected coldly, checking his magazine by touch in the dark. "You just happen to be in the crossfire, and since you're the only one who can tell me who sent them, you're coming with me." "I told you, I don't know," I cried, trying to scramble backward toward the kitchen swinging doors. Matthew grabbed me by the collar of my apron, hauling me to my feet. "Move!" He shoved me toward the kitchen just as a fresh volley of bullets tore through the front of the counter, tearing chunks of laminate and wood into the air. We burst through the swinging doors into the dimly lit prep area. Sal was standing there, in his undershirt and boxers, holding a rolling pin and trembling violently. "Out the back," Matthew commanded, not even pausing to look at my boss. He dragged me past the massive stoves, through the heavy steel door that led to the alleyway. The cold rain hit me like a slap to the face. The alley was pitch black, smelling of rotting garbage and wet asphalt. Behind us, the gunfire in the diner continued, a terrifying cacophony of violence. "Where are we going?" I gasped, struggling to keep up with his long, rapid strides as he pulled me down the narrow passage. "Somewhere they can't find us," Matthew replied grimly. He stopped abruptly at the end of the alley, peering cautiously around the brick corner into the dark street. A sleek black SUV was idling violently a few yards away, engine purring aggressively. He looked back at me, his pale eyes catching the faint glow of a distant street lamp. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and for a brief second he looked less like a syndicate boss and more like a soldier surviving a war zone. "You paused the hit," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "The code you used. It told the spotter to hold on the assault. That gave me the seconds I needed to realize the trap. You saved my life, Nora, but you also proved you belong to a world that wants me dead." He grabbed my arm tighter, dragging me toward the SUV. "Now, I need to know why." The heavy armor-plated door of the SUV slammed shut, sealing us in a tomb of leather and silence. The driver, a shadow in the front seat, didn't wait for a command. The tires shrieked against the wet pavement as the massive vehicle tore away from the curb, leaving the violence of the diner behind in a blur of rain and flashing lights. I was thrown against the door panel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My uniform was soaked, plastered to my skin, smelling of stale coffee, rainwater, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of gunpowder. I huddled into the corner of the back seat, my knees pulled up to my chest, trembling uncontrollably. Matthew sat rigidly beside me. He didn't look back at the diner. He was already dialing a number on a sleek, encrypted phone. "The diner is gone," he said calmly into the device, his voice devoid of the adrenaline that was currently setting my nerves on fire. 3 shooters, automatic weapons, professional. They had a spotter on the street. Clean up the mess and find out who leaked my location. He hung up, slipping the phone back into his coat. He finally turned to look at me. The ambient light from the passing street lamps cast long, harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the dangerous intelligence in his pale eyes. "You're shaking," he observed. It wasn't a question, just a cold statement of fact. "I was just almost shot to death over a cup of coffee," I snapped, the adrenaline finally overriding my fear of him. "Excuse me if I'm not perfectly composed." Matthew didn't smile, but a flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossed his features. "You handled yourself well under fire. You didn't freeze. You moved when told. Most civilians turn into statues. I told you, I'm just a waitress, and I told you to stop lying to me." He replied, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register again. He leaned closer, the scent of rain and leather overwhelming the small space. "A waitress from Ohio doesn't speak Palermitano. A waitress doesn't know the countersign for a syndicate hit. A waitress doesn't survive a firefight with the poise of someone who's seen it before." He reached out slowly, deliberately, and pulled a small, jagged piece of safety glass from my wet hair. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, examining it in the dim light. "So, let's try this again," he said softly. "Who are you, really? And why are you hiding in my city?" I stared at the piece of glass, the silence stretching out between us, thick and suffocating. The engine hummed beneath us. The rain battered the reinforced windows. I was trapped. I had survived the massacre of my family by disappearing, by becoming a ghost. If I revealed my true name, I was bringing the ghost back to life. I would be a target again. But if I lied to the man sitting next to me, a man who controlled the criminal underworld of this city with an iron fist, he would likely kill me himself before the night was over. "If I tell you," I whispered, my voice trembling, "they will kill me. The people who sent those men tonight. If they find out who I am, I'm dead." Matthew's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The people who sent those men tonight were aiming at me. That means my enemies are your enemies. In my world, that makes us allies. Temporary, perhaps, but allies nonetheless." He leaned back against the leather seat, tossing the shard of glass onto the floorboard. "Tell me your name, the real one, and I give you my word, no one will touch you while you are in my custody." A syndicate boss's word. It was a currency written in blood, easily spent and easily broken. But as I looked into his pale eyes, I saw a strange, rigid code of honor. beneath the violence. He was a killer. Yes, but he wasn't a butcher. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I closed my eyes, visualizing the terracotta tiles of my childhood home, the lemon groves, my father's stern face. My name, I said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue, is Eleonora Falcone. The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of the tires on the wet road. When I finally opened my eyes, Matthew was staring at me. The cold, calculating demeanor had vanished, replaced by an expression of genuine, profound shock. It was the first time I had seen the mask slip. Falcone, he breathed, the word carrying a sudden, immense weight. He leaned forward, staring at me as if searching for a ghost in my features. Alessandro Falcone's daughter, the youngest. You knew him? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. Matthew looked away, staring out the darkened window at the passing city. The muscles in his jaw worked tightly. Knew him? He echoed softly. Your father was the only reason I survived my first war. He gave me sanctuary when the rest of the commission wanted my head on a spike. I owe the Falcone family a blood debt. He turned slowly back to me, the pale gray of his eyes now burning with a fierce, protective intensity. They said you all died in the massacre, he said, his voice rough. They said the Corleonesi wiped out the entire bloodline. They missed the mouse in the walls, I whispered, tears finally spilling over my lashes, mixing with the rain on my cheeks. Matthew stared at me for a long time. Then he reached over and hit a button on the intercom to the driver. Change of plans, Marcus, he said, his tone authoritative, leaving no room for argument. We aren't going to the warehouse. Take us to the safe house, the deep one, and burn the route. He looked back at me. You aren't a hostage anymore, Eleonora. You're under my protection. The safe house was a brutalist concrete structure hidden deep within the city's industrial district, masquerading as a defunct textile factory. Inside, it was a fortress of reinforced steel, sparse utilitarian furniture, and an arsenal that could supply a small army. We arrived just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy rain clouds. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the night finally crashed, leaving me weak, shivering, and profoundly exhausted. Matthew ushered me inside, locking a series of heavy deadbolts behind us. The air inside was dry and smelled faintly of gun oil and stale air freshener. He pointed to a small Spartan bathroom off the main living area. There are clean clothes in the cabinet. Towels. Get out of the wet uniform, he ordered, his voice flat, businesslike. He stripped off his soaked overcoat, throwing it over a metal chair. As he turned, I saw it. A dark, spreading stain on the left side of his crisp white dress shirt, just beneath his ribs. You're bleeding, I said, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He glanced down at his side as if noticing it for the first time. He grimaced slightly, pressing a hand against the stain. Graze from the diner. Ricochet, probably. It's nothing. It's not nothing. It's bleeding heavily, I argued, stepping toward him. 3 years of playing the subservient waitress vanished. I was falling back into the rhythms of my past, where patching up wounded men in secret was a necessary skill. Sit down. Let me look at it. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement breaking through his stoic facade. Giving orders to a syndicate boss, Eleonora? That's dangerous. You owe my father a debt, I retorted, gesturing to the chair. Consider this part of the collection. Sit. He held my gaze for a moment before slowly lowering himself into the metal chair. He unbuttoned his shirt, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the wound. It was an ugly, ragged tear across his side, bleeding sluggishly, but consistently. I went to the bathroom, found a first aid kit, and returned. The silence between us was different now. The hostility and fear had mutated into a tense, tentative understanding. I knelt beside him, opening the kit. "This is going to sting," I warned, soaking a gauze pad in antiseptic. "I've had worse," he muttered, staring straight ahead. As I cleaned the wound, the proximity was overwhelming. The heat radiating from his skin, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the raw, coiled power resting just beneath the surface. He was a dangerous man, a killer, a criminal. Yet, in this sterile room, bleeding and trusting me to patch him up, he was intensely human. "Why did you run?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet, vibrating in his chest. I paused, pressing a fresh bandage against his side. "Because I was 14, and everyone I loved had just been slaughtered. The Corleonesi wouldn't have stopped until the Falcone name was erased completely." "Your father had allies," Matthew said, wincing slightly as I taped the bandage down. "He had me. You could have come to me. I didn't know who to trust," I replied bitterly. "The hit was orchestrated from the inside. Someone within our own ranks gave them the security codes to the estate. My father's allies could have been his betrayers. So, I became a ghost." I sat back on my heels, looking up at him. "And what about you? Why did the Corleonesi send a hit squad into a public diner tonight? You're not at war with them. You have a truce." Matthew's expression hardened, his eyes growing icy. "A truce is just a pause to reload. But you're right. An open hit like that is reckless. It's desperate." He leaned forward, looking down at me with a terrifying intensity. "They aren't coming after me because of territory, Eleonora. They're coming after me because of a ledger." "A ledger? Before your father died," Matthew explained, his voice low. He realized there was a traitor. He didn't know exactly who, but he knew the Corleonesi were paying off key figures in the old families to orchestrate a massive takeover. He compiled the evidence, bank transfers, names, dates, the definitive proof of the betrayal that destroyed your family. He hid the ledger. He paused, his eyes searching my face. "Your father sent me a message a week before he was killed. He said he had secured the evidence. He said if anything happened to him, the key to finding the ledger was with his most trusted confidant." My blood ran cold. I stared at him, the pieces falling into a horrifying puzzle. "Me. He meant me." Matthew nodded slowly. "He told me he embedded the location in a story he told you. A memory. Something only you would understand. The Corleonesi must have found out you were alive. They must have tracked you to my city. The hit tonight, it wasn't just to kill me." He reached out, his hand gently resting on my shoulder. The touch was grounding, heavy with a protective oath. "They were trying to eliminate me because I'm the only one who would protect you. They want the ledger, Eleonora. And you are the only one who knows where it is." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the safe house, staring at Matthew, the world tilting violently on its axis. A ledger, proof of the betrayal. Proof that my family's massacre wasn't just a bloody turf war, but a calculated, orchestrated genocide, aided by traitors within our own ranks. And my father, stoic, protective, doomed Alessandro Falcone, had hidden the key in my childhood memories. I don't know anything," I stammered, my mind racing through thousands of conversations, bedtime stories, and quiet warnings. He told me so many things. He taught me the codes, the histories, but he never mentioned a ledger. "He wouldn't have," Matthew said, buttoning his shirt over the fresh bandage. He stood up, pacing the small room, the adrenaline returning to his system. He knew you were a child. If he told you outright, he made you a target. He had to hide it in plain sight. In a memory. Think, Eleonora, the weeks before the attack. Did he give you anything? A gift? A specific phrase? I closed my eyes, desperately digging into the trauma I had spent 3 years trying to bury. I bypassed the memories of the gunfire, the blood, the agonizing silence in the walls. I pushed back to the golden afternoons, the scent of the lemon groves. He gave me a book, I whispered, the memory suddenly surfacing, vivid and sharp. Matthew stopped pacing, his gaze snapping to me. What kind of book? It was a first edition of Dante's Inferno. It was his favorite. But he gave it to me a few days before the attack. He told me that the deepest circle of hell is reserved for traitors. I opened my eyes, looking at Matthew, my heart pounding. He said, "When the cold comes, Eleonora, look to the traitors in the ice." Matthew's eyes widened slightly. The traitors in the ice. The 9th circle. He walked to a small metal table in the corner and pulled out a secure laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "What are you doing?" I asked, pushing myself up from the floor. "Your father owned property all over Europe," Matthew muttered, his eyes locked on the screen. Shell companies. Hidden assets. If he hid something physical, something important enough to destroy the Corleonesi, he wouldn't bury it in the ground. He'd put it somewhere secure. He hid a key, and a map populated the screen. A safety deposit box, he deduced. But under what name? The 9th circle, I said softly, the logic of my father's mind slowly unlocking within me. Dante. Traitors in the ice. Look for properties or accounts tied to the names in the 9th circle. Judas, Brutus, Cassius. Matthew's fingers paused over the keys. He looked at me, a profound respect dawning in his eyes. "You have your father's mind." He typed rapidly. A few seconds later, a single hit appeared on the screen. "A private Swiss bank in Geneva," Matthew read, his voice tight with triumph. "An account opened under the holding company, Cassius Investments. The signatory is an alias your father used for secure transactions." He closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "The ledger is in Geneva. We have the location, but we don't have the key," I pointed out, the initial thrill of discovery fading into the grim reality of our situation. Swiss banks require physical keys or biometric scans, and even if we get it, how does that help us right now? We are trapped in a safe house, and an army of assassins is turning the city upside down looking for us. "We use it as leverage," Matthew said coldly, his mind already formulating a war strategy. "The Corleonesi don't know we know where it is. They think they can kill us and take the secret to the grave. We leak the location to the commission, the ruling council of all the families. We tell them we have proof of the Corleonesi's betrayal. It will start a war that will tear the syndicate apart, but it will paint a target so large on their backs that they won't have the resources to hunt us." "You would start a Mafia war to protect me?" I asked, staring at him. Matthew walked back to me, closing the distance until he was standing mere inches away. His presence was overwhelming. A dark, protective shadow. "I owe your father a blood debt," he repeated, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "But this isn't just about the debt anymore. They brought their war into my city. They shot up my territory. They threatened something under my protection." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, a touch so tender it contrasted violently with the brutal words he spoke. "I am going to burn them to the ground, Eleonora, for my city, for your family, and for you." Before I could process the intensity in his eyes, before I could decipher the sudden, terrifying flutter in my chest, a harsh, metallic screech shattered the quiet of the room. The heavy steel door of the safe house groaned, shuddering violently. Someone was cutting through the external hinges with a thermal lance. The Corleonesi hadn't needed to search the whole city. They had tracked us. They found us, I breathed. The paralyzing terror returning, freezing the blood in my veins. "Get down," Matthew commanded, his tenderness vanishing instantly, replaced by the cold, lethal efficiency of a syndicate boss at war. He moved with terrifying speed, shoving me behind a heavy concrete support pillar in the center of the room. He grabbed an assault rifle from the weapons cache against the wall, checking the magazine, racking the slide. He tossed a heavy, black handgun onto the floor at my feet. "Take the safety off. Point and pull," he ordered, not looking back. "If anyone comes around this pillar who isn't me, you empty the magazine into them. Do you understand?" I stared at the gun. It looked heavy, ugly, and smelled of death. The last time I had held a gun, I was 14, and my father was placing it in my trembling hands, telling me to hide in the walls. I can't," I stammered, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't even reach for it. "I've spent 3 years trying to stop being this person." Matthew turned back to me. His eyes were ablaze, not with anger, but with a desperate, urgent fire. "You are Eleonora Falcone. You have the blood of lions in your veins. You survived a massacre by being smart. Now you have to survive this by being strong. Pick up the gun." A blinding shower of sparks erupted from the main door as the thermal lance chewed through the final hinge. The heavy steel groaned ominously. We had seconds. I looked at Matthew, then down at the gun. The terrified waitress, Nora, wanted to curl into a ball and weep, but beneath her, buried beneath layers of trauma and fear, the ghost of Eleonora Falcone stirred. They had killed my father. They had killed my brothers. And now, they had come into the rain-soaked city to finish the job. I reached down and wrapped my hands around the cold metal grip. It was heavy, but the weight felt suddenly grounding. I flicked the safety off with a sharp metallic click. Matthew gave me a grim, approving nod. "Stay low. Wait for my signal." He moved to a tactical position behind an overturned steel table, leveling his rifle at the door. With a deafening crash, the heavy steel door was kicked inward, collapsing onto the concrete floor in a cloud of dust and smoke. Instantly, the air was torn apart by the roar of automatic gunfire. The safe house lit up with the stroboscopic flashes of muzzle bursts. Matthew returned fire, a disciplined, controlled rhythm of controlled bursts that contrasted wildly with the frantic spraying of the attackers. I huddled behind the concrete pillar, my hands clamped tightly over my ears, the handgun pressed against my chest. The noise was apocalyptic. Chunks of concrete rained down on me as bullets chewed into the pillar above my head. "2 down, 3 pushing the left flank," Matthew roared over the din, his voice a commanding anchor in the chaos. I peeked around the edge of the pillar. The smoke was thick, acrid, stinging my eyes. I saw dark shapes moving in the gloom, tactical gear and laser sights cutting through the dust. One of the shapes broke away from the main group, rushing toward the rear of the safe house, flanking Matthew's position. He didn't see him. Matthew was pinned down, focused on the heavy suppressing fire coming from the doorway. The attacker raised his weapon, aiming directly at Matthew's exposed back. Time seemed to slow down. The terrified waitress vanished completely. Instinct, cold and primal, took over. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I raised the heavy handgun, gripping it with both hands, perfectly mirroring the stance my father had taught me in the sun-drenched courtyard a lifetime ago. The attacker heard my movement and started to pivot. I didn't close my eyes. I pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred my arms, the deafening boom echoing in the confined space. The attacker jerked violently backward, dropping his weapon. Collapsing onto the concrete floor, Matthew spun around, his eyes wide, seeing the fallen man, then looking at me standing there, the smoking gun in my hands. There was no time for words. The remaining attackers, realizing their flank had failed, concentrated all their fire on my position. "Eleonora, move!" Matthew screamed. He laid down a massive wall of covering fire, forcing the attackers to duck behind cover. I dove back behind the pillar just as a spray of bullets shattered the concrete where I had been standing a millisecond before. The firefight raged for what felt like hours, though it could have only been minutes. The air grew thick with cordite and dust. We were outnumbered, but Matthew fought like a demon, using the terrain of the safe house with lethal precision. Finally, the return fire began to slacken. There was a desperate shout in Italian, a command to fall back. The Corleonesi hitmen, realizing they were losing too many men to a single entrenched target, were cutting their losses. The sound of scrambling boots echoed through the doorway, followed by the screech of tires outside as their vehicles sped away. Then, silence. A heavy, ringing silence that felt louder than the gunfire. I stayed huddled behind the pillar, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The gun slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. Footsteps approached, slow, heavy. Matthew appeared around the edge of the pillar. He was covered in concrete dust, a new cut bleeding freely down his cheek. He looked exhausted, brutalized, but undeniably victorious. He looked down at me, then at the gun on the floor, then at the body of the man I had shot. Slowly, he reached down, offering me his hand. "The mice," he said softly, his pale eyes holding a mixture of awe and fierce pride. "Have teeth, after all." I reached up, grasping his hand. He pulled me to my feet, his grip strong, anchoring me to reality. The ghost of Nora, the waitress, was dead. Eleonora Falcone had returned. The aftermath of violence is always profoundly quiet. By noon the next day, the rain had finally stopped. The city was bathed in a pale, weak sunlight that reflected off the puddles on the scarred asphalt outside the safe house. Matthew's network had moved with terrifying efficiency. The bodies were gone. The safe house was scrubbed. His lieutenant, the giant man with the scar, had arrived with a fresh change of clothes, burner phones, and encrypted laptops. I sat at the metal table, nursing a cup of black coffee. It tasted vastly different from the burnt sludge I had served at Sal's diner. It tasted like survival. Matthew sat across from me, a fresh bandage on his cheek, his dark hair slicked back. He was looking at a secure tablet, the glow of the screen reflecting in his pale eyes. "The message has been sent to the commission," he said quietly, not looking up. "We leaked the location of the ledger in Geneva. We provided enough circumstantial evidence of the Corleonese's betrayal to force an inquiry. The other families are furious. The Corleonesi are currently fighting a war on 5 fronts. They are bleeding." He set the tablet down, finally looking at me. "They won't come after you anymore, Eleonora. They don't have the resources, and even if they did, coming after the key when the location of the ledger is already known to the commission is pointless. The secret is out. Your father's vengeance is finally happening." I stared into my coffee cup. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 3 years, the fear, the paranoia, the guilt of surviving, was slowly beginning to lift. It felt strange to breathe without it. "And what about you?" I asked, meeting his gaze. "You started a war." Matthew smiled faintly, a cold, predatory expression. "I thrive in war. It cleanses the syndicate. It removes the weak and exposes the traitors. This city is mine, and no one brings violence into my city without paying the toll." He stood up, walking around the table to stand beside me. He reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small, heavy envelope, sliding it onto the table in front of me. New passports, fresh identities, a substantial amount of untraceable funds, he listed calmly. You can go anywhere. Start a new life. Be someone else entirely. You don't have to be a ghost anymore. I looked at the envelope. It was freedom. It was the chance to disappear again, properly this time, without the lingering shadows of Palermo hanging over me. I looked up at Matthew, the man who had terrified me 12 hours ago, the man whose life I had accidentally saved, the man who had bled for me, fought for me, and honored a debt to a dead father. I've spent 3 years being someone else, I said slowly, pushing the envelope slightly away. I was Nora. She was tired, and she was scared, and she hid in the walls. I stood up, facing him. The physical proximity between us crackled with an unspoken tension, forged in the crucible of the firefight. I don't want to hide anymore, I said, my voice steady, carrying the ancestral weight of my family name. My father didn't teach me the codes so I could run away forever. He taught me so I could survive until it was time to fight back. Matthew's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before locking onto my eyes again. The air between us grew impossibly heavy. This is a violent world, Eleonora, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Once you fully step back into it, there is no stepping out. It will consume you. I know, I replied, stepping closer, closing the final inch between us. But I think I'd rather be consumed by the fire than freeze to death in the shadows. Matthew stared at me, a profound, shifting realization taking root in his eyes. He saw me not as a debt to be paid, not as a liability to be protected, but as an equal, the last heir of the Falcone family, forged in tragedy, hardened by survival. He didn't say another word. He reached up, his hand tangling gently in my hair, and pulled me in. The kiss was like the man himself demanding, fiercely protective, and carrying the dangerous promise of a storm. It was an acknowledgement of the blood we shared, the trauma we understood, and the chaotic future we were about to navigate together. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine. His breathing was ragged. You aren't a waitress anymore, he whispered, his thumb brushing my cheekline. No, I agreed softly. He stepped back, the syndicate boss returning, though the coldness in his eyes had been permanently replaced by a burning, unyielding loyalty. He turned to the door, gesturing for his lieutenant to enter. The large man stepped inside, looking from Matthew to me, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Matthew looked at him, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The lockdown is over, Matthew commanded. He looked back at me, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. But she isn't leaving.